All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome to the 2007-2008 National Public Policy Forum semifinals. My name is Kit Sars, and I'm Executive Director of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation. We're thrilled to be with everybody here. I was supposed to say live from New York, it's Saturday morning, but I decided not to. Someone had passed that line on to me. We're delighted to be here. It's been a long, hard fight for our competitors, and we're so thrilled you all are here and so proud of you, all of our teams who are here today. Before I introduce our contestants and our distinguished panel of judges, I just want to share with you a little bit about the National Public Policy Forum. As you can see in your printed program, which hopefully everyone picked up on their way in, the National Public Policy Forum, or NPPF, as we call it, was founded in 2001 by the national litigation firm of Bickle and Brewer. It's the only national contest that gives high school students the opportunity to participate in written and oral debates on issues of public policy. Open to any public or private high school in the country, this free program is now jointly administered by Bickle and Brewer and New York University. Last October, we invited schools from across the country to submit essays on the public policy topic, Resolved: the United States federal government should substantially increase its AIDS/HIV public health assistance to sub-Saharan Africa. These students here today and hundreds of others from across the country accepted our invitation. At that point, a single elimination written debate tournament began. The judging continued for several months until March 5th, when our final 4 teams, those here today, were announced. The final 4 teams were invited to New York this weekend as guests of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation, where they will supplement their written arguments with oral advocacy. And as we mentioned earlier, as many of you all know, for the first time in National Public Policy Forum history, we are streaming the semifinal and final debates today over the internet. So a big thanks to Professor Tuna Snyder and Travis Carter for coordinating this new element of the competition. Hopefully, you told your friends and family to watch you in action from home in their pajamas this morning, and maybe next year they'll even be able to vote for you. So hello to all of you all out in Webland. Thank you for joining us. In our first semifinal debate, Colleyville Heritage High School of Colleyville, Texas, takes on Wellington High School of Wellington, Florida. Colleyville Heritage is coached by Dave Houston, and today's debaters are Lyndon Lee, Andrew Murray, Alex Naz, and Jonathan Wang. Wellington is coached by Paul Gaba, and today's debaters are Chelsea Fitzgerald, Haley Kolich, Raquel Krauscher, and Michael Steckschulte. Whoops. So best of luck to you all today. We're really, really proud of you, and we can't wait to hear the debates. And now to introduce our distinguished moderator and judges. NPPF moderator David Baker currently serves as the Director of Admissions at the St. Mark's School of Texas in Dallas. Prior to assuming this position, Mr. Baker coached debate and taught public speaking for 16 years. Under his direction, the St. Mark's debate program was named one of the 10 most successful programs in the 20th century. That was that last century. In 2003, Mr. Baker was inducted into the National Forensic League Hall of Fame and was also presented with the Distinguished Community Service Award by the National Debate Coaches Association. Mr. Baker has been a longtime supporter of the NPPF, working with the law firm of Bickle and Brewer to develop this national competition. So we're thrilled to have him back again as our moderator. Now to our judges. First, Will Baker. Will Baker brings 20 years of experience in policy debate and nonprofit management to his position as CEO of the Impact Coalition. Previously, Mr. Baker was an Assembly district leader and a UN NGO representative. He teaches argumentation at NYU and directs their award-winning debate team, several of whom are here today with us. Mr. Baker also oversees the Associated Leaders of Urban Debate, a national initiative to publicize and expand the reach of debate into urban communities. Mr. Baker is a member of the NPPF Advisory Board. Next to him, Marshall Donat. As Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Starwood Hotels and Resorts Worldwide, Marshall Donat provides legal counsel in the areas of hotel management, contract owner relations, franchise development, and mixed-use condominium hotel contracts. Prior to joining Starwood, he was the General Counsel for the North American division of Club Med, Inc. He's had a pretty swell job all along. Headquartered in New York City, and also he served as Associate Counsel for Pan American World Airways. Mr. Donat is trustee on the board of the New York School for the Deaf and a member of the planning board for the town of Harrison. Next to Mr. Donat, we have Luke McGrath. Luke McGrath received his Bachelor of Arts degree with honors in History and European Development from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Mr. McGrath received his JD from Fordham Law School right here in the city, where the International Law Journal awarded him the MCI Fordham International Law Fellowship. Following graduation, he served as an assistant district attorney before returning to Fordham as an adjunct professor and the fellow in international human rights for Fordham's Crowley program. He later clerked for the Honorable Nicholas G. Garifas and then worked with some other firms before joining Bickel & Brewer in 2004. A partner at Bickel & Brewer, Mr. McGrath is also a member of the Screen Actors Guild, that's for his creative side, and the New York County Lawyers Association, so we're thrilled to have him as well. Next to Mr. McGrath, we have Professor Alfred C. Tuna Snyder. Tuna Snyder is the Edwin W. Lawrence Professor of Forensics at the University of Vermont and director of one of the largest and most successful college debate programs in the country. He has spent the last 35 years promoting debate and critical communication as an alternative to violence and conflict, as well as a method for achieving real democracy in a true civil society. He has done formal debate training in 19 countries and has trained debaters from over 35 nations at the World Debate Institute sessions in the U.S., Korea, and Slovenia. Professor Snyder has received every major award given to debate educators in the U.S. During his career, he has edited or written over 50 volumes about debating and for debaters. He has also served as president of the USA's Cross-Examination Debate Association, and for the last several years has been director of operations for the NFL's National High School Speech and Debate Championship. And our final panelist and judge for today, Pam Spiliadis. For the last 9 years, Ms. Spiliadis has channeled her passion for social justice, education, and youth development as the founding executive director of the Baltimore Urban Debate League. She earned her undergraduate degree from Brandeis University with a dual major in psychology and African American studies, and her master's degree from the University of Maryland's School of Social Work. In 2006, her league in Baltimore was honored at the White House with the Coming Up Taller Award as one of the nation's best youth development programs. She has been honored as a Weinberg Fellow, a winner of the Be More Award, and a Greater Baltimore Committee Fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our distinguished judges. A quick reminder to turn any cell phones off, please. And now I will direct your attention to Mr. Baker, who will explain the rules of the competition and get today's proceedings underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit. And good morning, everyone, and welcome. I think everyone is relatively familiar with the format, but for you, as a reminder, and for those who are watching the debate this morning, we will briefly review how the debate will proceed. Somewhat unique to the two semifinal debates is that the panel of judges has been in possession of your written exchanges for some time, and so they are somewhat acquainted with that. So the semifinals combines the elements of the written work you've already done and the oral advocacy that you will do here today. As all of you know, that will be substantively distinct from what we will be doing in the finals for the two teams that advance to that exhibition. We will begin the debate with opening statements by team captains for the affirmative and the negative, and then we will enter a cross-examination period in which each member of each team will ask a question and each member of each team will answer a question. Following that, a very unique element of this competition is that the judge questioning period will commence, and the judges will be allowed to ask questions. It will be my role to direct those questions fairly evenly to both sides, and we'll do that as best we can. Following that, there will be rebuttal statements by both sides, and then the debate will conclude. We will try to stay, as Kit indicated, as close on time as possible, but do understand we started just a little bit late, and we'll make sure that everybody gets the full amount of time that they are supposed to have. I will ask both the teams to keep an eye over in this direction, as I will be, to some degree, where I need to, I will be directing questions to individuals to balance things out just a little bit. We'll let that go by itself as long as it will. But if it starts to get a little lopsided on one side or another, I know, you know, your team captain would never hog the questions, but just in case that doesn't work out all that well, I will direct those questions a little more equitably. So I got your back. In other words, we'll make sure everybody gets to participate. And as far as time signals are concerned, I'm presuming your opening statements and your rebuttals are probably largely timed. I will give you in the opening statements, I will give you a time signal at 5 and at 1, and in the closing rebuttal statement, I'll give you a time signal at 2 and 1, if that's okay. All righty? Everybody ready to have some fun? Okay. Enjoy yourselves. All right? These guys are nowhere near as scary as they may appear to be. I know them all. All righty. Let's have fun. We have the opening statement by the affirmative team captain, please.
Thank you very much. The HIV/AIDS epidemic presents a health and policy crisis for sub-Saharan Africa. Existing measures, while steps in the right direction, woefully lack adequate focus. The virus continues to devastate the sub-Saharan African population, largely due to a lack of medical infrastructure and a chronic shortage of health professionals. Current approaches to combating the disease emphasize the provision of antiretroviral drugs, and while providing ARVs has its merit, dumping these drugs without at the same time developing a feasible, long-term system of distribution is counterproductive. Therefore, it is imperative that we affirm the resolution. The United States federal government should substantially increase its HIV/AIDS public health assistance to sub-Saharan Africa by establishing a global health service program to expand the capacity of infrastructure and community health workers in the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief-focused countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The HIV/AIDS epidemic is an unprecedented threat to the international community. The disease is extremely virulent and imperils the security of all nations by burdening healthcare systems and adversely impacting economies and societies. The concern is acute in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region most heavily affected by HIV/AIDS, with infection rates in some countries over 30%. The HIV prevalence rates in this region are due to the lack of adequate healthcare systems, exacerbated by a dearth of healthcare workers. According to Lori Garrett, Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations, health systems are key, and quick fix approaches to disease surveillance and control won't work in countries that have no adequate systems of public health care. The overwhelming lack of infrastructure complicates treatment and prevention, allowing the virus to spread mercilessly. Garrett, in her 2007 January Foreign Policy article, warns that focusing on HIV/AIDS may lead to a myopic focus at the expense of other health services. Using the proposals that she endorses, the affirmative directly establishes infrastructure, sends American volunteers, and uses native health professionals through a global health service which bypasses implementation difficulties in African nations and opens up the resources to fight other diseases. HIV/AIDS perpetuates cycles of conflict and poverty, depriving African nations of a stable source of labor and weakening economic foundations. Direct economic assistance to businesses or governments is ineffective without first addressing the disease. According to former World Bank Director James Wolfenson, nothing we have seen is a greater challenge to the peace and stability of African nations than the epidemic of AIDS. Furthermore, Peter Singer, a senior director at the Brookings Institute, states that AIDS not only threatens to heighten the risk of war, but also multiplies its impact. The disease will hollow out state capacities in general, weakening it to the point of collapse. The ultimate dynamic of warfare and AIDS is that their combination makes both more likely and more devastating. Economic assistance will yield no benefit when the disease causes conflict within and between nations. Armed conflict increases the likelihood of mutation and spread of HIV strains due to the transmigration and uprooting of populations. This grim reality is proven by the recent conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where violence has created a veritable witch's brew of AIDS, bringing together various strains from around the continent. The results are new strains being produced that researchers have called strange recombinants. The international community is already having difficulty grappling with current strains of HIV/AIDS. A new strain would eliminate progress and inflict massive casualties. The stark reality of the toll of HIV calls for immediate action. Current U.S. assistance fails to address critical factors of sustainable health measures, the development of healthcare infrastructure, and the retention of African health professionals. According to Fitzhugh Mullen, professor of prevention and community health at George Washington University, the dearth of health workers to treat and care for HIV-infected individuals has reached crisis proportions. The few health professionals practicing in many of the countries highly impacted by HIV/AIDS, often stressed, ill-prepared, and scant in number, must now cope with a staggering new burden of disease while at the same time acquiring the knowledge, skills, and technology to deliver lifelong antiretroviral drug regimens, clinical and palliative care, and prevention services. The shortage is reflected by the fact that only one doctor is produced for every 115,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa. The shortage of healthcare professionals is worsening. Recent studies show that less than 10% of doctors trained in Zambia since its independence in 1964 have remained in the country. The remaining 90% have migrated to Europe and the United States. Numerous other African countries exhibit a similar exodus. For instance, 80% of Ghana's doctors leave the country within 5 years of finishing their studies. The bottom line is that numerous push and pull factors exist to encourage emigration, and without remedial steps, this tremendous shortage of healthcare workers in sub-Saharan Africa will continue to cripple the fight against AIDS. Robust numbers of well-trained healthcare workers are the first step to establishing and maintaining effective healthcare infrastructure. As stated by the Joint Learning Initiative, a consortium of over 100 health professionals, we need to urgently develop strategies to mobilize, retain, and train health workers to combat HIV/AIDS and other problems while steadily building healthcare systems. Without functioning public health and medical systems in place, PEPFAR and its like are just big band-aids that barely cover gaping wounds. Absent effective infrastructure, the provision of antiretroviral drugs and other treatment methods are only a temporary solution at best. Inadequate infrastructure also prevents the distribution of drugs, with fewer than 25% of Africans who needed ARVs to survive receiving them, and the fraction dwindling to less than 5% in rural areas. Lack of proper distribution methods also fosters a black market in ARVs. Arthur Kwemba, a member of the International Consortium of Journalists at the Center for Public Integrity, writes that in countries like Kenya, the quickest way to get antiretroviral drugs is to hang around on the sidewalk and wait for a hustler to strike up a conversation. Patients may be registering for treatment at more than one PEPFAR-supported clinic to receive duplicate doses of their medication. Redundant doses of ARVs resurface in black markets where they are sold to those who lack access to clinics and sites that distribute the drugs. This is extremely dangerous because haphazard self-medication will increase the risk that a user's HIV infection will become drug-resistant. Such a mutation would intensify the HIV/AIDS problem, and preventing such a catastrophe will require appropriate training, support, and quality control of providers and health sectors. The establishment of a global health service to build healthcare capacity in impoverished regions is crucial. By focusing on the training of local health workers, the program would bring U.S. expertise to the region. The program, according to Paul Davis, Director of Government Relations at the Health Act Global Access Project, can serve as a temporary catalyst for building new healthcare capacity while simultaneously drawing upon health professionals to engage in educating and training to local persons to improve healthcare outcomes, indigenous healthcare delivery capacity, and self-sufficiency. The principal benefit of such health workers is that they are likely to remain in rural and deprived areas. They may relate better to communities by being less elitist and more integrated. These homegrown doctors can serve as a first line of referral to health professionals, guarantee consistent usage of ARVs, but will have less incentive to succumb to the various pull factors that are decimating current African health services. Furthermore, the GHS would provide comprehensive sex education, which would dispel popular myths about HIV/AIDS, especially in underserved populations where the most egregious abuse of women take place. This education would also include information about avoiding mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS, one of the most common transmission processes. United States action on this front would also bolster its reputation at a time when the country's standing and influence are at all-time lows. The United States' focus on military force erodes its ability to wage a diplomatic campaign and contribute to the international perception of the United States as a proverbial school bully. This loss of diplomacy makes it difficult for the United States to attain its international goals. According to Joseph Nye, former dean of Harvard's Kennedy School, if American policies lose their legitimacy in the eyes of others, attitudes of distrust tend to fester and reduces our leverage further. This would foster American resentment towards others, resulting in dangerous isolationism. According to Niall Ferguson, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, if the United States retreats from a global hegemony, its fragile self-image dented by minor setbacks, its assistance programs would follow suit, and in Africa, the great plague of AIDS would continue its deadly work. Establishing a GHS will foster relationships and multicultural understandings while mitigating anti-American sentiment overseas, and would enable the United States to assume symbolic and substantive leadership in meeting present challenges to global health. Pursuing such strategies would take great strides towards the repairing the United States' fragile standing in the world. The United States can and should play a crucial role in the development of healthcare infrastructure to combat HIV/AIDS, and the positive results could have a ripple effect for assistance in other regions of the world. A GHS can provide health service concurrent with and primarily as a means to train and activate local replacements, strengthen health systems, and reach underserved areas and populations. An effective response by the United States in Sub-Saharan Africa would have historic consequences. If the approach used in Sub-Saharan Africa is successful, it could be extended to other regions of the world with broad economic and political consequences. Effective responses to the HIV/AIDS pandemic are contingent upon the continued primacy of the United States. As stated by Bradley Thayer, an international affairs senior analyst at the National Institute for Public Policy, this primacy has given the United States the ability to shape the behavior of states and international institutions. Multinational organizations experience major cleavages that divide the international body on matters great and trivial, hampering their ability to act decisively. A leading role should be assigned to the United States when dealing with public health issues such as HIV/AIDS because there's no other state, group of states, or international organization that can provide these global benefits. None even come close. Over 1 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa died as a result of HIV/AIDS in 2007. The United States can embrace this opportunity for meaningful leadership through a global health service, establishing healthcare infrastructure and building a core of African healthcare workers. We thus urge the panel to affirm the resolution and move towards a long-term solution to the HIV/AIDS crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Jonathan. The opening statement by the negative team captain for a period of 10 minutes.
At the leisure of Mr. Baker and the judge panel. Everyone ready? A citizen wanting to impress his neighbors can build a magnificent home that is unmatched in its beauty and innovation. However, despite its majesty, if the house has a poor foundation, it will ultimately collapse. We can see this parallels to today's situation to substantially increase AIDS relief in Sub-Saharan Africa, because no matter how valiant the effort, if the system is subpar, then it will ultimately fail. Let us first start out today by understanding what excessive foreign aid can do to a developing nation. For our first contention, when foreign aid is given solely to one area, such as AIDS, other areas of health services become overshadowed and neglected. Laurie Garrett, a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, believes a problem with the current public health assistance is the fact that health aid is almost always stovepiped down narrow channels relating to a particular program or disease. She also states from an operational perspective, this means that a government may receive considerable funds to support, for an example, an ARV distribution program for mothers and children living in the nation's capital, but the same government may have no financial capacity to support basic maternal health and infant health programs. So HIV-positive mothers are given drugs to hold their infection at bay and prevent passage to their infants, but at the same time cannot even obtain the most rudimentary obstetric and gynecological care or even infant immunizations. It is imperative to point out that the affirmative has failed to give even a moderate estimate for the cost of creating a global health service. And furthermore, creating such an elaborate program for one focus area, and that being HIV/AIDS, would cause other areas of health service, which are desperate for financial assistance, to be greatly neglected. In all actuality, to spend such time, work, effort, and concentration of international resources as the affirmative has proposed with the creation of a GHS solely for the treatment of HIV/AIDS would without question deprive other areas of health assistance from much needed relief, bringing us to our next area of analysis. For second contention, the United States federal government should not substantially increase its AIDS/HIV public health assistance to Sub-Saharan Africa because as long as the region is afflicted with poverty, poor social services, limited formal education on AIDS, shady leadership, and other severe disadvantages, any and all attempts to combating HIV/AIDS will be unsuccessful. It is critical to tie the abundance of AIDS in Africa with its high poverty level. While this relationship has several complex factors, the bottom line is clear. The impoverished have less access to education, food, job training, and healthcare, leading them to be more susceptible to AIDS and more disadvantaged at receiving care once they are infected. Furthermore, the World Bank cites that in Sub-Saharan Africa, inadequate access to employment opportunities, physical access, credit markets, and above all, a lack of participation and failure to draw the poor into the design and development programs are the top reasons for Sub-Saharan African society's poverty. But to make matters even worse, these problems rest in the hands of weak governments. Henceforth, it can be seen that this void in government inaction has created a leak of poverty into Africa that has pushed AIDS to the forefront. Logically, should the United States try to seal and repair this leak, or should it simply place a bucket of foreign aid under the leak to appease the problem for a short term? It is imperative to understand that a substantial increase in health aid would not adequately improve the AIDS epidemic that so easily spreads over Africa due to the continent's governmental and economic weaknesses. The United States should use funds and services to strengthen governments and basic infrastructures of sub-Saharan countries at the root of the AIDS problem, rather than futilely increasing relief with AIDS for the short term. Moreover, the problem of government corruption guarantees that the affirmative's plan for a global health service would be extremely ineffective and would simply add more money on an ever-growing pile with little positive results in return. The negative gives the examples of President Yama Jema of Gambia, who claims that the cure for AIDS is his own 7-herb concoction, and President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, who continues to deny that AIDS is even caused by HIV. Thus, the negative has asked the question, how can America trust these leaders with substantially more than $50 billion in health aid? The affirmative claims that these two examples do not give justification for the United States to distrust against leading figures in the focus nations of sub-Saharan Africa. However, Laurie Garrett again stated that corrupt governments divert many resources to the pockets of the non-poor. Garrett then cited a 2006 report by the World Bank estimating that about half of all funds donated for health efforts in sub-Saharan Africa never reach the clinics and hospitals at the end of the line. The fact is, government corruption is far more prevalent than what the affirmative would like to believe. Thus, the negative ramifications would heavily outweigh the benefits of their proposal. Even if a global health service were enacted, it would quickly be deprived of the services and the resources needed to maintain it, and the United States would continue to simply throw money at its problems. Now, let us address the ramifications of a global health service itself. First, we must analyze the affirmative claim that a GHS would stop the exodus of African healthcare workers to developed nations. At a glance, the affirmative plan would seem sensible. However, the question arises, why are they leaving? Laurie Garrett points out that in the nation of Ghana, there are only 2,500 physicians. However, right here in New York City, there are over 600 physicians from the nation of Ghana itself. The affirmative would like to attribute the extreme shortage of healthcare workers in sub-Saharan nations to poor healthcare infrastructure. However, this isn't the only case. A major factor contributing to the decline of healthcare workers in developing nations is the United States' own domestic health worker shortage the United States faces today. As Ms. Garrett points out, by 2013, the United States itself will face a nursing shortage of 800,000 and a physician shortage of 200,000. Now, although the healthcare worker crisis is a problem, it would seem logical that the cause weighs heavier on the fact that physicians are always drawn to the needs and countless opportunities to the American healthcare market. If the United States is to end emigration of physicians out of sub-Saharan nations, it would seem logical that the United States work to end its own dependency on foreign healthcare workers rather than instituting an entirely new federal bureaucracy. Furthermore, a global health service calls for physicians to be given an annual salary of $35,000 a year. However, this number isn't going to be very competitive and effective when countless other opportunities and many more doors are open and available to African physicians in the United States healthcare market, where physicians can make up to hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. For them, the choice will be simple. Clearly, the only way to decrease physician emigration is for the United States to first significantly decrease its own dependency on foreign healthcare workers. However, until then, the creation of a GHS will be futile. Moreover, a massive influx of foreign assistance to sub-Saharan African nations can wreak tremendous economic havoc on the region. Now, a massive infusion of foreign cash into the public sector can undermine local manufacturing and economic development. This is known as the Dutch disease, where spending of externally derived funds exceeds domestic private sector and manufacturing investments. As a result, the nation's economy could suffer rapid inflation and would become destabilized. So a substantial increase at aiming to bolster the salaries of local officials could cause economic depressions that could destroy any opportunity of achieving the goals that the United States is so desperately to achieve. So it is imperative to show the distinction that the affirmative seeks on the path of providing more and more funding toward growing problems, whereas the negative looks to halt the growth of the main problems that plague the United States' current efforts. Thus it is imperative that the United States halt the continuation of skirting around the issues which are the cause of the AIDS epidemic. The negative believes the United States must first aim to solve the problems of inefficient government which deprive healthcare infrastructures in weak African economies. The affirmative would like to believe that a GHS would work to effectively combat the HIV/AIDS epidemic. However, inefficient government in weak African economies would make that simply impossible, bringing us to our next area of analysis. For our third contention, the United States federal government should not substantially increase its HIV/AIDS public health assistance to sub-Saharan Africa because gender issues must be addressed in order for any positive change to be made. Beyond visibly measurable measures such as economic power and government effectiveness, the role of women, or lack thereof, in sub-Saharan Africa contributes largely to the AIDS epidemic and should be addressed by our country by lobbying for these women's rights and working through organized grassroots efforts in Africa to reduce violence against females before health AIDS is increased yet again. For instance, women in this region are regularly discriminated against when it comes to employment, education, healthcare, credit, and ownership rights. In South Africa, according to the Inter-Press Service, it is estimated that 1 in 3 married women suffer from domestic violence. Unfortunately, this has led to a large percentage of women taking part in the commercial sex industry, with a majority of those suffering from HIV/AIDS. So, rape is prevalent in these countries where false rumors of the cure leads infected men to rape young virgins in the hopes of curing themselves. Now, the affirmative claims that this GHS to this problem would be addressed through a public education. However, until the United States puts immense pressure on the governments of sub-Saharan Africa to change their domestic policies, this effort is going to be futile. For our final contention, the United States should not substantially increase its HIV/AIDS public health assistance to sub-Saharan Africa because increasing health assistance for HIV/AIDS will only supplement the poor policies rather than help change them, which the negative wishes to do. No, so if anything, the United States has already established itself today as the nation of opportunity, the nation of hope for the millions in sub-Saharan Africa inflicted with HIV. The truth is, if the United States wants to continue to lead the way in the world's efforts in Africa, then it would seem logical that the United States solve the problems that plague our current relief efforts. The United States was founded on a principle believing in the potential of every person in every nation. However, throughout history, with the growth of every country, has came new obstacles and new challenges that we had to solve before we can move forward. And with the problems that we see today, until the United States can solve the issues that plague our current relief efforts, then our current attempts at combating HIV/AIDS will be ineffective. Thus, we must negate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. To remind both the panel and all of the members of our audience, as we start the questioning period, to be reminded that the teams were assigned the sides that they are on. They did not choose those sides, and we are here to evaluate the debate on criteria of clarity of argument, evidentiary support, depth of analysis, refutation, quality of presentation, understanding that personal beliefs about the nature of the topic itself are not part of the evaluation process. And with that, I will ask Jonathan, I guess, who will be asking the first question on behalf of the affirmative.
Rather than providing blank checks and dumping foreign aid on foreign countries, the proposal would include U.S. oversight and directly build infrastructure, send American volunteers, and train local health professionals, which your author, Lori Garrett, does not assume. How do your corrupt government arguments assume the specific nature of our proposal?
Well, I'd first like to point out that in that same report from Ms. Garrett, that actually it states that 49% of our current relief efforts don't even make it to the healthcare facilities at the end of the line because of corrupt governments and the money going into the pockets of the non-poor. So corruption in the governments in that case is going to cause heavy influx of negating what we are essentially trying to do, and that's get the money to the poor. But when half of it isn't doing so, then something has to be done there, and we have to take a pause and say, what's the problem? And furthermore, under the creation of a GHS, well, the only way that it would be relevant to today's resolution if it was specifically towards that of HIV/AIDS. However, in that same case, in that same case of that would be essentially stovepiping even more funds into just HIV/AIDS, where there are significant other problems such as malaria, and I can even cite more for you, time permitting, from Ms. Garrett, that shows that we need to aim outside of just HIV/AIDS to combat the problems that we face in sub-Saharan Africa.
A question from the negative to the affirmative.
Okay. Actually, relating to... Oh, okay.
It needs to be somebody else. Go ahead.
Does the United States, which has a shortage of health workers itself, promote the exodus of medical workers from sub-Saharan Africa by recruiting for its own health system? And if so, should it adopt policies to halt this, as Great Britain has, rather than legislatively increase worker visas for those in-demand workers?
You cite the...
someone other than the captain. That's okay.
Well, they don't actively promote recruiting health workers. It just inadvertently happens because there are numerous push and pull factors that exist that compel workers to migrate away from these countries, such as the comparative salary discrepancies that you outlined in your speech. And perhaps the United States federal government should try to decrease its dependence on foreign workers. But if it does institute policies that prevent health workers from migrating to the United States, that won't change the fact that these health workers will still try to, they'll still want to migrate to European countries, things like that. So the fact is that we have to first remove the push factors that compel people to leave these areas, and the way to do that is by training community health workers, which is what the proposal focuses on.
A question from the affirmative. It needs to either be from Landon or Alex.
In your negative argumentation, you quote senior fellow Lori Garrett as said below about talking about how aid is almost stovepiped, almost always stovepiped. Garrett seems to be criticizing the fact that when we give large checks to Africa, this becomes corrupt and given to a certain area. The proposal would send individuals, American volunteers, to train indigenous workers. How would that be relevant when Garrett, at the conclusion of her article, also states that health systems are key and that when, quote, quick fix approaches to disease and surveillance and control will not work in countries that have no adequate systems of public health and medical care?
The answer from either Haley or Raquel.
Well, one of the major problems we're seeing with creating the GHS is it's going to have 6 interrelated programs, and while you may be funding people within the nation, the healthcare people, training them in there, you're still going to, the problem is the amount of money sending over, because it's going to cost a large amount of money to start creating. Instead, we should pass legislation like Britain did and essentially allow the people to sort of eliminate taking people from Africa to go over. The GHS really does nothing to stop the migration of people from Africa to other countries. So I think it would be better to pass legislation eliminating the United States taking away foreign workers from Africa.
Thank you. A question from Raquel for Landon.
To add on to the government thing we were just, just a question. In your opening statement, you mentioned that in Kenya, people double up on ARVs and they seem to hustle them on the street. Wouldn't you consider this a problem stemming from the fact that governments in Kenya only give about $6.50 per capita per person based on for healthcare systems for each person?
Actually, our argument is that these people are going to PEPFAR clinics and getting redundant doses by registering for multiple clinics and then selling those redundant doses onto the black market, which are then bought by those who lack access to these clinics, which the GHS would specifically help by establishing this infrastructure, thereby improving credibility and improving accessibility of the ARVs that would be provided by PEPFAR.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the team cross-examination period, and that brings us to the questioning period for judges. With my apology, I can't see everyone quite as clearly. If you just sort of wave at me so I can identify you. We will sort of direct this as best we can. There's no time limit on the length of the question, obviously. We'd like to keep the answers to these questions a minute or under. So if you can sort of keep that time frame in mind. Questions from the panel. Dr. Snyder.
Well, nobody seems to be speaking up in defense of the indigenous governments in Africa. So I want to ask the affirmative, what are you asking African governments to do to participate in this program? Do they do nothing, or do they control where the clinics are? Do they control where how much happens where, or is that all done by the United States? Or, I mean, their argument is that these governments are corrupt, they'll steal the money, they'll goof things up. How are you all going to get around that?
Andrew?
Well, first, a lot of the negative arguments assume that we're just throwing money at the problem, i.e. giving blank checks to African governments. That is not what we do. We send health professionals of the United States to these areas, and they go and they train rural health workers. So it's hard to understand how corrupt governments are going to siphon those funds in a negative fashion at all. most of the emphasis is going to be on the United States increasing assistance and like managing it. I mean, there'll be necessity of some interaction with the African governments, but we're not demanding that they increase resources, things like that. We're just trying to assist them with building health infrastructure, and we're not necessarily giving them the resources, but we're going and we're training people in rural areas. I hope that answered your question. Is there anything else that?
Yeah, I mean, what if they don't like being told what to do by the U.S. and all their money? It's like, okay, we're here to save you from HIV/AIDS, but you can't be involved because we don't trust you. I mean, do you expect any hostility on the part of governments, or?
I mean, there could be hostility, but we're not forcing any African governments to accept our assistance. If they don't want our assistance, then they can just reject any global health service excursions in those areas. Also, President Bush recently traveled to Africa. He traveled to numerous PEPFAR-focused countries, which we give assistance to, and he received very warm welcome from those African nations. They like what we're doing right now. They like the PEPFAR assistance, but they want to be helped in further fighting the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which has crippled their nations.
Thank you. Another question from the panel? Yes, sir.
This is a question for the affirmative. We heard the negative talk about the brain drain, so I want to ask about that. I think I heard the response, maybe it was from you, Andrew, that that by training local personnel, people on the needs of the program, that would somehow avoid a desire to immigrate. I'm not sure I followed that.
Well, the argument is that when American health professionals go in and train rural workers, those workers will have less incentive to succumb to the various pull factors, which are drawing these workers away to other countries because they are less elitist and they have cultural ties to the regions in which they work. Does that answer your question?
Okay. All right. Pam?
I had a question for the negative team. I believe in your opening remarks, you had stated that part of your plan was that the U.S. should become more involved in the restructuring of governments. Is that correct? I guess I wanted to ask you, because you talk also about excessive foreign aid being bad for sub-Saharan Africa. I wonder how your involvement in the restructuring in government is different from that.
The way that we want to help these governments out is, of course, not by throwing foreign aid at them. We are entirely against that. But there are diplomatic efforts and lobbying efforts that could be put in place, grassroots activism, to push for less corrupt governments and more equal rights throughout the area.
Follow up with another question? Oh, okay. All right. Mr. McGrath?
This is for the negative as well. One of the points that you're making, to follow up on Pam's question, was that infrastructure needed to be developed. Now, the affirmative is stating that infrastructure needs to be developed with regard to setting up a GHS. Wouldn't you be agreeing, in effect, with that a global health service is part of the infrastructure that's needed, and the debate is whether it should be focused solely on HIV or focused on what global means, which is health services in a global capacity?
Though we both obviously agree that the infrastructure in Africa is clearly failing, what we don't agree with is the system of the GHS, because the fact is that if we do implement this GHS, that the African emigration will not stop. It will just continue, and the most important thing right now for Africa is to keep the intelligence and to keep the innovation and technology also in Africa instead of continually draining it. And the GHS would simply just continually take that away by placing American workers in Africa instead of trying to actually innovate and improve conditions in Africa itself.
Mr. Mr. Baker.
I want to follow up on Marshall's question from before, 'cause I'm still not seeing how the economics add up. My guess is that some of the doctors and folks who came from Ghana previous to this had ties to their communities, were associated with areas. So what is the magic of the affirmative community health worker system that suddenly makes them immune to these offers of opportunities to migrate to other areas? Andrew's answer before seems to be kind of conceding the notion that people will still be going, but I don't see how you would solve if that's true.
These local health workers would, as stated before, be trained at a local level as opposed to by the American volunteers that we would send, as opposed to, say, institutions that would open them up to, like maybe Europe or the United States. Furthermore, they, as we said before, they would have these cultural ties, so to speak, in addition to being less elitist, because they would be just basically village-level workers that would be accredited with helping the local populaces as per the affirmative constructive.
So do they have less knowledge or less monetary savvy? In other words, will they not be prepared or qualified so they can't take these jobs in America or Europe? Or is it a situation where you're just so convinced that they're going to be so in love with their local situation that that offer to make 4 times as much to go to a foreign country is going to not be persuasive to them?
Well, it's not that they won't be less qualified, that they'll be less qualified than other health professionals, but they won't be trained in medical schools, things like that. So perhaps in that sense they'd be less qualified, but argument is just that we would send American doctors there to train those people. But since they don't have this degree that they can point to, developed nations would be less inclined to try and pick them up. And yes, while it's true that there might be some people who are still inclined to move away from the country, our emphasis on training people in rural areas rather than most doctors right now who are taken from Africa live in urban settings, things like that. Argument is that when we train people in rural areas, they have much heavier ties to their community because that's how most African societies work.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
This is a question for the negative. You said earlier that the corruption in these countries is an obstacle to the affirmative plan, and that until the corruption is addressed, the plan won't succeed or will be greatly diminished. Given the rate and extent of the loss of life, is there sufficient time to solve the underlying corruption problem?
Well, I think a major goal of the United States should be moving in towards diplomatic efforts directly with these countries. However, we can admit that's going to be a problem when the president of South Africa can't even understand basic medicine where HIV causes AIDS, and another one claims that his own 7-herb concoction that only he knows that actually cures the disease. So the problem is we're dealing with people such as this. So of course it's going to be a huge obstacle. What we're saying is essentially right now, if you're going to say we're going to establish this global health service immediately, as another question that I saw pulled out is that maybe these governments don't essentially even want the United States to end this policy in the first place. So until we make sure that we know that we can work with these countries, that we have established diplomatic ties and entrusted between us, then the United States should not move to increase our funding even more. And furthermore, I don't see it necessarily on April 2nd, 2008, the House of Representatives actually passed a reauthorization of PEPFAR at $50 billion. And many of these people, if we don't have this entrustment, I don't see how we can support them more with $50 billion.
So following up then, Michael, are you saying it's all or nothing?
Not necessarily. I'm saying that the United States has already given $50 billion, and the United States should take a stop and take a pause and see where that brings us. But if it's not going to happen and we're going to have 49% of our efforts not even making it down to the healthcare clinics in need because of these corrupt governments and then putting monies into the pockets of the non-poor, then if this is the way it's going to be, then the United States needs to stop and take a time out and then make sure that we have the diplomatic ties this time before any increase in health assistance is given. And the affirmatives plan almost does nothing at all to establish those diplomatic ties.
Thank you, Michael. Other questions from the panel? Dr. Snyder?
So, affirmative, are you telling me that you're going to take, Africa's a big place, thousands, tens of thousands of American doctors who probably don't want to go to rural Africa to learn one of dozens of different languages to train local people, a wonderful opportunity, but I just, are you really think doctors are going to go and do that? And as a follow-up, you think there's any political fallout from that when there's going to be a doctor shortage in the United States and they're training people in rural Africa?
Alex, why don't you take this one?
We'll take this one. But as Michael just stated, the PEPFAR increase has already been $50 billion. PEPFAR already includes volunteers like doctors and such. It's just our argument is that currently this is a focus on funding and not infrastructure. We would use existing volunteers under the PEPFAR organization and I guess like other volunteers similar to Peace Corps organizations, and we would send volunteers overseas. Currently within these 15 focus countries, the U.S. has already established cultural ties and such with countries like Tanzania and Ghana, proven by Bush's visit to that country. And these PEPFAR countries already exist in these programs. We would just change the focus of PEPFAR to focus more on infrastructure rather than simply funding. And as for the political fallout, I'm not really sure, I guess, what that necessarily would entail given that PEPFAR already exists. I don't know what the distinction would be as to why focusing on infrastructure would be necessarily different from just giving funding and checks to Africa.
Thank you. Other questions? Will?
Question for the negative. I'm trying to determine whether or not your argument comes down to an issue of time frame or strategy. Let's say 5 years from now, we've gone ahead with the notion of diplomacy and we have a better situation. We actually have a leader that, thinks AIDS can't be solved by a 7-herb concoction in their bathroom. And once we've moved to that point, there still seems to be a question of what to do. Is the argument of the negative that a global health service is a bad idea, or is the argument of the negative simply that it's a bad idea right now because we might inevitably need it? The second level of that question is the affirmative asserts that the conclusion of one of your primary authors that you all both use, Ms. Guerra, is actually that we need a health system. I just want to know if you all will concur with that assessment.
Haley, can I get you to take this one? Thank you.
Okay, regarding the Global Health Service Corps, we see that as a problem because it's basically 6 interconnected programs, and we don't see an incentive for American doctors to go over to Africa because they're offering them $35,000 a year to stay in Africa, and as Mr. Sanders said, learn a bunch of different languages, and we don't see why American doctors would do this. What we instead need to do is revamp the infrastructure of the medical system in Africa and not have this brain drain that's occurring. The GHS, which my opponents are proposing, does absolutely nothing to solve the brain drain and solve the migration of African doctors to other countries. They keep mention how with American doctors training them, it's going to increase their cultural ties, but that's not going to happen. If you have an American doctor coming into Africa, it's not going to give them more ties to their culture. They already have that. The problem is they're getting more money from other countries, and we should follow like other countries like Great Britain did and pass legislation eliminating us going into that nation and trying to recruit doctors instead of doing this GHS and increasing funding and creating a giant bureaucracy.
Follow up, Mr. Fred?
Yeah, let me take you back to the very first sentence that you had there. What you said is that we should revamp the African medical system as part of the solution. I'm trying to understand what's different between revamping the solution and perhaps, I don't know, creating an infrastructure.
When we say revamping the entire health infrastructure, we have to look at what our opponents propose within the scope of the topic. Since the resolution is only specific to HIV/AIDS, they can technically only propose that we improve the HIV/AIDS infrastructure. Whereas on the negative, we believe that the entire health infrastructure needs work. These people are dying from malaria. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest rate of maternal mortality during birth. So basically what we want to do is help cause improvements within the health infrastructure itself rather than just stovepiping down narrow channels of HIV/AIDS.
Thank you. Chelsea, appreciate that. Other questions from the panel? Yes, sir. Mr. McGrath?
This is to the affirmative and builds upon this discussion. Is the affirmative's position that they are seeking a overlay of an infrastructure separate and apart from the existing local infrastructure. In other words, just a different form of stovepiping, but having a bureaucratic and health global services infrastructure that is not tied to the current existing structure that's in place?
Landon, Alex, or Jonathan?
I'm sorry, could you actually just repeat that question very briefly?
Are you suggesting that there be a infrastructure put in place specific for HIV, or is your suggestion that there be an infrastructure that is tied to either existing infrastructure or global health services infrastructure that is not limited to HIV?
Sure. What we would say is that currently, as they've stated, PEPFAR recently in the beginning of this month has allocated $50 billion of assistance to PEPFAR. They removed things like absence funding. Our argument is that we should change the focus of PEPFAR currently. Currently, PEPFAR lacks a focus on infrastructure, i.e. there's no training of community capacity building. There's no ground level, bottom up approach towards this. We would simply say that infrastructure through PEPFAR should be focused towards HIV and AIDS. So I guess it would still be within current infrastructure, which is failing, and we try and bolster that to allow the workforce of Africa to increase, because as we state, almost 30% of some countries are incapacitated by the HIV/AIDS. We would state that by helping on the grassroots level to increase infrastructure, we would be able to create more sustainable systems of African governments that allow more productivity, as they would no longer be incapacitated by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So I guess no, it would not be a separate form of infrastructure. We would just change the current focus of PEPFAR.
Thank you. Any questions? Sure.
For the affirmative again, the negative said that one of the major disadvantages of your program in stovepiping into AIDS would be the weakening of the other basic medical needs. What is your answer to that?
Landon or Jonathan? Take that one.
As stated by Alex, right now the HIV/AIDS crisis is devastating African populations. More than 30% of the workforce in some countries are being disabled because of this virus. Now, the affirmative plan would functionally solve this problem and allow these countries to set up an economic foundation and political foundation in order to address other problems. So essentially building this infrastructure would open up other resources to the combating of other diseases, which takes into account the arguments that Lori Garrett makes.
Would the negative respond to that?
Haley or Raquel?
Our argument is that by building up infrastructure to address the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we would be able to open up other resources to fight other diseases, because currently HIV and AIDS hurts the working force, preventing African nations from creating an economic foundation and political foundation.
Even though that might be a meritable idea, the fact remains that the GHS really in its outline doesn't provide anything that would show the way that we would actually distribute the funds, the way that these governments that aren't even taking that much of an initiative to fight HIV/AIDS on their own would actually be able to support that and actually distribute funds to different ideas like the fight against malaria, different political institutions, and that many health clinics don't even have clean water or usable needles, and we need money for that, and the best way to do that would not be through a GHS system.
Okay. Questions? Yes, Pam.
Okay. If this is for the affirmative, the negative have pointed out to some extent in their written arguments, and I believe to some extent here orally, some weaknesses to PEPFAR in terms of it actually being effective in addressing HIV, and some of the things that were mentioned were the abstinence policies that weren't working. I wonder if you can talk about the GHS being set up within that PEPFAR structure and how you avoid continuing those sorts of weaknesses.
Landon, can you take that one for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, actually, at the beginning of this month, the House actually passed a bill expanding the funding of PEPFAR, as you know, by to $50 billion. But in addition to that, it also, in that bill, removed the abstinence-only requirement the funding, the abstinence-only funding requirement. Furthermore, the Global Health Service would be establishing infrastructure and educating doctors as opposed to promoting these abstinence-only, I guess, ideals, so to speak, because we're just accrediting local doctors to administer ARVs and whatnot while simultaneously establishing this infrastructure that we're talking about.
Thank you. Are there questions for the negative? Yes. Actually, that's fine. If we have a question for the affirmative, let's do it.
We heard this is for the affirmative. We heard the negative tell us the importance of, or the problem really, of the gender issue. And I won't go through it, but I think you heard it. So what is your answer to how your plan will overcome that inherent obstacle?
Either Alex, Jonathan, or Landon, please.
Well, our argument is that currently HIV/AIDS is infecting large swaths of the population, not just women. Additionally, in the negative paper, they tout comprehensive sex education as a potential solution to this problem. I'm pretty sure it's in their either rebuttal paper or their constructive paper. And the Global Health Service, in addition to providing this sort of education to dispel these myths about HIV/AIDS, such as raping virgins to cure AIDS and whatnot, the Global Health Service would also mitigate the AIDS problem in sub-Saharan Africa, which, as stated in Jonathan's speech, would AIDS perpetuates these cycles of conflict. And as we know, conflict in Africa has empirically led to some of the worst instances of human rights abuses, especially those of women, where women have been raped and where women have been raped and stuff. And furthermore, we also get to rural areas where these myths would be most prevalent.
The Global Health Service, is that an existing organization or this is a newly created one?
There was an individual, Fitzhugh Mullen, who's like a medical doctor, and he has been working with Congress. And this is just a proposal he has put before Congress that has yet to be implemented. We would just draw from the basis that Mullen established to extrapolate upon that and use funding and such to, I guess, bolster the initiative. It's just a proposal he created for Congress.
Is it practical to set up a new organization in a continent the size and Africa?
Given the fact that it's still within the PEPFAR authorization, that PEPFAR funding's been increased already, we would just change the focus for PEPFAR. So it'd be more practical than establishing a new organization, because we would simply just use these new PEPFAR finances to fund this global health service that was recently allocated.
And this organization could reach into the local communities that you talked about earlier, you think?
It would
doesn't exist today?
Ideally, the focus of it would be to go to these rural areas where currently PEPFAR lacks a focus on, because it goes towards like big city mainstream areas. We would try and expand this to rural populations where, as Lyndon said, these myths about AIDS are most prevalent because of a lack of national organization given by the government, and we would have a focus of sending doctors to those areas as a means to as a means to alleviate the problem.
Thank you. Are there questions for the negative? Yes, Will?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. All right, we got problems. We got gender problems, we have corruption problems, we have all these problems which seem to be systemic. Now, can you explain to the people who may be dying of AIDS in the next couple of years why we have to wait before we give them the affirmative program so that we can solve these other problems? I mean, how do you explain to them, I'm sorry, you have to have a better government first. I'm sorry, you have to deal with gender issues first. I'm sorry, you have to, because they're not going to particularly like that.
We have to look at the fact that the Congress recently passed legislation increasing PEPFAR by $50 billion a year. So we still are going to be funding AIDS in Africa, but we're saying we shouldn't increase that anymore by creating the Global Health Service, because it's not going to solve the problems like the brain drain that we mentioned in our case, nor is it going to solve the gender issues. But we are already funding $50 billion a year to AIDS. So yes, they are going to be receiving funding, but we believe we can make that funding used better if we revamp the medical system and allow them to have access to the resources better for all diseases, not just stovepiping it for AIDS.
Thank you. We have additional questions for the negative. We're a little bit lopsided one way. If we could direct them that way, yes.
So I'm a little confused. The $50 billion that today is earmarked to be spent, is the affirmative suggesting to increase that amount, which is what the resolution is, and to what number?
Jonathan, could you take that for us, please?
We would just increase the, we would just take $100 million for the program.
You mean double it from 50 to 100? Are you going to spend it differently and keep it just 50?
We would just,
or
wait. Right, we would increase assistance by $100 million, right, by using, through PEPFAR.
100 million or billion?
100 million.
Wait, this, did I understand right? There was 50 billion that's allocated, so 100 million is like a fraction. No.
Well, we would just be taking money away from the allocation from the PEPFAR and taking $100 million to implement the Global Health Service.
And that's substantially increasing aid?
Yeah, I can help this. What he means is the proposal proposed by Mullen would require $100 million. We would use these extra fundings from PEPFAR to bolster this $100 million. We would scale it up. We don't know the exact specification number. That's not really been something we've been able to research. We would just simply take this $100 million as the base level and then augment it with these PEPFAR funds to change the focus towards infrastructure in order to increase assistance.
Mr. McGrath?
This is for the negative. Your position is that upwards of 50% never gets to the clinics. So why would it be a bad idea to go from 50 billion higher to increase the amount of money that's actually getting to the clinics?
Well, if this is going to continue, you're going to have $50 billion and only $25 billion of that is actually going to make it to the pockets of the people who don't have it. Now, it doesn't seem very logical where you have half of our funds not making it down to the people who need it. I just see that as American taxpayers' dollars being thrown in the garbage. So essentially, the United States needs to ensure that the funds that we are giving are making it to the people of sub-Saharan Africa who are in desperate need and the ones that we are trying to help. And to reiterate on something earlier, we feel their pain and we know exactly, it's a reality that many of us could not imagine. However, the United States is working to solve this crisis and working with the world to develop sub-Saharan Africa to one day be on par with the rest of the world. But in that case, we need to do it responsibly, we need to do it correctly, and I don't see it as being very correct when half of our funds aren't even making it to the people who need them. I just see that as inefficiency.
Follow up on that?
Sure, go right ahead.
Sure. Well, what if you dog-eared 75 billion and 5 billion was further dog-eared to ensure compliance that at least 40 billion went directly to the clinics?
Hi, I'd like to take that over. The statistic where 50% of health aid does not reach is a broad statement. It includes all global organizations, NGOs, charity organizations, everyone. People that basically just give aid directly to the African government. When we look at PEPFAR, it's not giving money to their governments at all. As we stated before, we have a mistrust of those people. PEPFAR is totally orchestrated by the United States. We are our own clinics, our own facilities. They're all built from the ground up. So the hypothetical assertion that $25 billion is all that will be sent is false because we're not handing that money to the government. It's all controlled by the United States.
Didn't you just discredit what Michael said?
I just wanted to make a correction.
Follow up with a question. Staying on this $50 billion, Exxon, one company in America, made $50 billion in 1 year. So when you have human lives at stake, is it really a big deal whether it's 50% or 22%? Do you put a price tag on human life?
Haley or Raquel, please.
Okay, well, there has to be a limit on how much funding. The United States is currently the #1 funder for AIDS in Africa, and we are also the #1 funder for the United Nations. So yes, we are giving them money to give over to Africa, but there has to be a point where we say, look, this is enough, because the United States is close to entering a recession, so we're trying to limit the amount we're giving. So $50 billion we think is a good amount.
We have time for one more question. The question needs to be directed to the negative and specifically to Raquel. Does someone have a question for Raquel? Yes, go right ahead.
Raquel, could you address the statement made by Chelsea that PEPFAR already provides a certain amount of infrastructure where clinics are built from the ground up, and that the U.S. government money currently that's going to PEPFAR is going directly and is being utilized to create what appears to sound like similar infrastructure that is being touted by the affirmative? Why is it bad to just increase that funding and direct it to a PEPFAR-like global health services organization?
I don't know if it's been touched on much in the cross-examination period, but I know it's in most of our cases, and I know Michael mentioned in the opening statement that if we continually giving externally derived funds to the public sector of African nations, their economies will essentially collapse, because these American workers that have to go to Africa, their salaries, of course, will have to be increased. This will lead to a huge inflation in Africa, which could drive prices of necessities for Africans to prices they simply cannot afford. This would stem homelessness, malnutrition, and essentially bring us back to a cycle of poverty, which is one of the reasons why HIV transmission is so common in Africa to begin with.
Thank you very much. This concludes the questioning period with the judges, and my congratulations to both teams. Well done. Very, very well done. We will finish this debate and close the debate with two rebuttal statements. The first, the rebuttals may be presented by any member of the team, and the first rebuttal will come from the negative for a period not to exceed 5 minutes. Negative goes first. I'll give you 2 minutes, okay. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Okay. My opponents and I can agree on one thing, as stated in their case. Without effective infrastructure, ARVs and other methods, treatments merely provide a temporary solution at best. We can all agree that the AIDS crisis is all-encompassing and simply devastating, but the worst thing that we can do would be substantially increase AIDS funding even past its $50 billion. First, we would like to address the fact that the affirmative side simply just agreed that they're really not increasing funding at all, and this would be simply out of the scope of the resolution. The negative side does not want to substantially increase AIDS funding because the GHS system promoted by the affirmative side simply will not work. What we have to do is get to the root of the problem and not simply fix the holes. We'd like to address 5 different ways why the GHS system would fail in this rebuttal. The first of which is that it's simply stovepiping. When we think of the resolution in HIV and AIDS funding, we have to understand that the African people, the African research and their technology, they cannot handle this right now, the ARV research and this funding, because they don't have clean needles, pure water, healthcare systems that actually work, and people that are willing to stay in Africa and actually distribute these ARVs. The GHS would not provide anything of the sort that would actually keep people in Africa, as well as providing clean instruments and trained professionals, besides the American volunteers, which would be stemmed into Africa. We also have research that 40% of African HIV infections can be linked to unsafe infection methods. Can we honestly provide a GHS system in Africa, throw a little more money on them, and expect them to have clean tools and actually be able to use the tools that the GHS would provide? It simply would be, as Michael said, inefficient and unbeneficial. The American people are eager to help the African people. We are eager to see our good work and our charity actually be used properly. But if it's not going to be used properly, and that 50% of the money sometimes doesn't even get to these clinics, why are we increasing even more? Our second main argument is that the governments are a major barrier to any kind of progress in Africa and AIDS HIV crisis. This is because we have presidents that don't even believe that HIV has a connection to AIDS, or that a 7-herb concoction, or that eating beetroot or the African potato will solve HIV/AIDS. This is a huge problem, because how can we tell them that the GHS is their best solution? As many of the panel have pointed out, the African people don't want us to just walk into their country and simply say, oh, you have to set up this GHS system, even though you might not have the tools or the utilities or the facilities to stem this up. And while many of the leaders of the countries don't even want us there. The severely subpar health systems are undoubtedly linked with the government's inadequacies, and by throwing money on these leaders won't make them actually use it more efficiently at all. As we can see in Kenya, they're getting all this money from PEPFAR for the past 5 years, and they still only spend $6.50 per capita for health for each person in Africa, even with HIV/AIDS, even with malaria, and even with one of the worst maternal death rates in the world. Our next point, which wasn't touched on very much, is women's rights. The GHS does nothing to change the PEPFAR plan in helping gender rights for women. And one of our opponents mentioned that we should believe in HIV/AIDS for everyone and not just women. And to be blunt, it's somewhat ignorant to say that because 77% of women report sexual violence is very common, and that HIV/AIDS is obviously spread far faster and far more to women simply because of sexual violence, and the fact that one of the main strategies for PEPFAR, ABC, abstinence, be faithful, and use condoms, be faithful simply isn't utilized because in African cultures, men don't stay faithful as much as they should, and that leads to the spread of HIV/AIDS. Our fourth point is that the GHS does not help healthcare immigration at all. We're simply bringing American workers into these GHSs in Africa if we were to affirm this. What would that do besides bring volunteers into Africa? Nothing. It wouldn't keep Africans in Africa. It wouldn't solve the drain brain. And the United States needs to find a way to increase health professionals in poor countries and also decrease its own dependency on foreign health workers, similar to the Commonwealth Code of Practice in 2002 passed in the United Kingdom. And our fifth point is that the GHS would lead to an economic collapse in Africa because we're putting so much funding in the public sector, and this would lead to salary increases for the American workers in Africa, which would lead to inflation, as previously mentioned, and that necessities such as water and food would be driven to prices that the Africans simply could not afford. And then this would stem malnutrition, homelessness, and HIV/AIDS would continue the cycle of poverty and can just continue it would just continue a large rate of transmission. What we need to do is not pass a GHS because it simply will not do anything for the African people. What we need to do is get to the root of a problem, and please negate.
Thank you very much. Final rebuttal statement for the affirmative team.
Ready? When making a decision that affects the lives and welfares of millions of human beings, tangible facts should be elevated to greater importance in hypothetical scenarios as they are irrefutable and actually provide a framework for evaluating the consequences of a particular action. Negative counters our proposal with charges of hypothetical inflation, hypothetical degradation of women's rights, hypothetical economic disaster, but ignores the fact that failure to assist Africa in fighting HIV/AIDS will result in well over 1 million deaths yearly. The negative desires to wait until changes are made regarding Africa before action, but the fact is that that is merely an excuse for inaction. Africa is not going to change to meet the negative's demands, and idly waiting is irresponsible because every day we delay, several thousand more condemned to death. It is not a question of whether the United States federal government should increase assistance to Africa because Congress is already working on reauthorizing PEPFAR with a $50 billion extension. The question is whether that assistance will subscribe to the failing practices that the negative indicts, or whether that assistance will have direction, have potency, and have the capacity to handle the practices that the negative indicts. As Mr. Donat has pointed out, no price is too much to save lives. The assistance is not so expensive as to justify letting millions die. We do advocate a substantial increase in assistance. We expand current funding and assistance by improving the efficacy of that assistance. Negative claims that HIV/AIDS assistance is stovepiped down narrow channels at the expense of overall health systems, and hence the plan would overall adversely affect public health. This operates under the flawed assumption that, like other donations, our plan is merely throwing money at the problem in the hopes of ameliorating the AIDS crisis. Their author, Garrett, cites a major reason for the poor health infrastructure as a mass exodus of health workers out of African nations. A global health service would reduce this by training community health workers that are less inclined to migrate away from the country. This is a tangible shift from the practices Garrett indicts, where the bulk of U.S. assistance comes in the form of blank checks and ARVs. Also, AIDS programs have empirically assisted in improving overall health by retaining doctors with expertise in numerous diseases as well as improving the quality of health clinics. Finally, HIV/AIDS itself undermines overall health by increasing susceptibility to other diseases. Such pervasive immunodeficiency is acknowledged by Garrett as a reason other diseases enact such a destructive toll in Africa. We also should not fall prey to the assumption that African governments are too incompetent to handle an increase. The negative cites failing health infrastructure and lack of clean tools as reasons African governments cannot be entrusted with American funds, but that failing infrastructure merely highlights the need for action. Africa is not the dark continent negative seems to believe it to be. Successes have been made in improving governmental accountability as governments such as that of Uganda have implemented comprehensive programs at fighting AIDS. Also, a few anecdotal examples of African leaders being incompetent does not justify withholding assistance from the entire continent. Finally, African governments will not change themselves. What is a better solution? Waiting until enough Africans die so that African leaders change their outlandish views on HIV/AIDS, or educating Africans in the hope of causing the African public to realize the necessity of improving public health? We acknowledge that some PEPFAR operations do not work to the advantage of women, but there is no alternative presented in this debate. It is better to increasing assistance to ARVs and contraception methods for women than to shun them, as the negative advocates with this demand to withhold assistance. There is certainly a lot of sexual violence against women in Africa, but patriarchy will not go away if the United States makes excuses. Also, as stated before, a function of the GHS would be to increase sexual education that would dispel common myths about HIV/AIDS in rural areas. In addition, the abstinence-based approach to negative indicts does not take into account two principal facts. First, that the government's current proposal for PEPFAR expansion also emphasizes contraception, monogamy, fidelity, and allows for reductions in abstinence funding if the AIDS coordinator deems appropriate. Second, negative claims that the U.S. should increase measures to lobby for women's rights, but there's nothing about the affirmative that precludes this. The U.S. should increase lobbying for women's rights. It should also fight a disease that perniciously targets women. Negative's final objection is that the proposal will somehow undermine African economies. As stated previously, HIV/AIDS exacerbates poverty in Africa by depleting the workforce and siphoning the funds of local governments that would otherwise be spent on other public health programs and poverty reduction programs. Charges of inflation are unfounded, as our approach to retaining doctors in Africa would not focus on raising wages, but instead on training community health workers in rural areas who are less inclined to migrate from the country because they have cultural ties to the region and live there. The U.S. must decrease the flow of health workers from developed nations to developing nations to developed nations, and the only way to do that is to remove the push factors that compel them to migrate. Current PEPFAR plans are inadequate, and they only attempt to cease American recruitment of health professionals. But these doctors will simply elect to move elsewhere, such as Europe, if they are not given an incentive to stay. American professionals will desire to travel to Africa. People from PEPFAR will be used for the affirmative, and organizations like the Peace Corps prove that people are willing to travel to developing nations to spread American goodwill. There's only one way to mitigate the AIDS crisis and provide the means to change the fate of those who would otherwise die, and that is to redefine our policy of assistance. No proposal could hope to eliminate every issue presented by the negative, but the affirmative is at least a step in the right direction. Only the affirmative presents a way of helping others abroad and enhancing the safety of Americans by diffusing a widespread anti-American sentiment. No clear-cut disadvantage to action is presented by the negative, only reasons why your proposal would not be fully effective. As such, the panel should err on the side of caution here and vote affirmative in the hope that this can make a difference. There's too much at stake to do anything less.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colleyville Heritage High School of Texas on the affirmative, Wellington High School of Florida on the negative. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you very much, teams. You all were fantastic. That was amazing. And spoken so eloquently, yet so quickly. So a big congratulations to you all, Colleyville Heritage and Wellington. Thank you so much to our judges. Thank you to David Baker. Please join us for the next semifinal debate, which will begin in this room at 10:45. So in about 15 minutes, we'll have a break, have some time for our judges to write their remarks, and we'll gather back at 10:45. Thank you.